Okay, so you want to own a car assembly factory. You buy the land, build the plant, hire some workers, and watch the cars roll off the line. Except here's the part nobody tells you. The factory itself is almost never where the money is made. The car business is one of the most capital-intensive industries on Earth, and most of the companies in it barely break even on the actual act of building cars. Toyota, one of the best-run manufacturers alive, averages a net profit margin of around 6 to 8%. Ford and GM have spent entire decades losing billions of dollars a year on vehicle sales alone. And yet, somehow, the people who figure out this business build some of the largest and most durable companies in history. So here's what this video is going to answer. What does it actually cost to build a car factory? How do you make money once you have one? And who is genuinely printing cash in this industry? And why? By the end, you'll have a real picture of the economics, two worked profit scenarios with real numbers, and a clear answer to the question everyone gets wrong. Where does the money actually come from? So what does it actually cost to build a car assembly factory? Let's start with the sticker shock, because it is genuinely extreme. A brand new greenfield car assembly plant, meaning you're building it from scratch on empty land, costs between $1 billion and $2 billion in the United States before a single car is built. That's the facility alone. The building, the stamping presses, the body shop, the paint shop, the assembly line conveyors, the robotics. When Volkswagen announced its first US plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 2008, it spent $1 billion just on the initial build-out. When Toyota built its plant in Georgetown, Kentucky back in 1988, it cost around $800 million at the time. Today, that same plant would cost well over $2 billion. BMW's plant in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which had opened in 1994 for about $400 million, has since had over $12 billion in cumulative investment poured into it over the decades. So the entry ticket is about $1.5 billion for a mid-sized greenfield plant in a developed country. That's the floor. But here's what that number doesn't include, and this is where people's brains start to melt. Before you build the factory, you need to develop the car itself. A single new vehicle platform costs between $1 billion and $6 billion in engineering and development before production starts. That covers design, crash testing, supplier contracts, tooling, software development, and regulatory compliance across every market you plan to sell in. Ford spent roughly $6 billion developing the F-150 Lightning. The new generation Chevy Silverado platform cost General Motors an estimated $1.5 billion. Then there's tooling, the custom dies, molds, and stamping equipment specific to each model. That's another $300 million to $700 million on top of the plant itself. And working capital, you need to buy steel, aluminum, glass, rubber, wiring harnesses, semiconductors, and tens of thousands of other parts before you sell a single vehicle. A factory running at 100,000 vehicles per year typically needs between $500 million and $800 million in inventory and receivables tied up in the pipeline at any given time. Add it all up, and realistically getting a new car brand's first plant to volume production costs somewhere between $3 billion and $8 billion. Rivian spent about $5 billion before it delivered its first vehicle at scale. Lucid Motors burned through over $4 billion. Tesla's Fremont factory, which it bought from Toyota and GM for just $42 million in 2010, still required over $1 billion in equipment before it was functional. Even that bargain deal shows you how expensive tooling and equipment are relative to the structure itself. Okay, so how does the money actually flow once the factory is running? Let's break it down simply, because the revenue model of a car company is stranger than it looks from the outside. The basic loop works like this. You build a vehicle for a certain cost. You sell it to a dealer or directly to a customer at a higher price. And the difference is your gross profit per vehicle. In theory, that sounds clean. In practice, the margins on manufacturing are brutally thin. The average cost to build a mid-size SUV in a US plant, covering materials, labor, energy, and direct overhead, runs between $28,000 and $36,000. That same SUV sells to a dealer for around $38,000 to $44,000, giving the manufacturer a gross profit per vehicle of roughly $3,000 to $8,000 before corporate overhead. Then subtract warranty reserves, which average about $1,500 to $2,500 per vehicle, marketing costs, dealer incentives, and regional pricing adjustments. You're often left with $2,000 to $4,000 of true operating profit per vehicle on a mainstream model. Multiply that by 200,000 vehicles per year at a mid-size plant, and you get $400 million to $800 million in annual operating income. That sounds big, but remember, you spent $3 to $8 billion getting here. At $600 million a year, your payback period is somewhere between 5 and 13 years, assuming nothing goes wrong. And things always go wrong. We'll get to that. Here's the key insight that changes how you see this entire industry. The assembly factory is not where the best margins are. The real money in the car business flows through three other channels: financial services, software and connected features, and high-margin vehicle segments. Financial services first. Ford Motor Credit, GM Financial, and Toyota Financial Services together generated over $20 billion in combined revenue in 2023. When you finance a car, the manufacturer's lending arm earns the interest. When you lease, they earn the depreciation spread, plus residual value management. Ford Credit alone contributed about $2.3 billion to Ford's bottom line in 2023, in a year when Ford's vehicle operations were marginally profitable at best. Without the finance arm, Ford's 2023 results would have looked significantly worse. Now, software. This is the newer play, and it's the one every manufacturer is chasing right now. Over-the-air software updates, connected services subscriptions, autopilot packages, remote start apps, and dealer-integrated telematics are all turning vehicles into recurring revenue platforms. General Motors projects its software and services division, called GM Ultify, will generate $25 billion in annual revenue by 2030. Tesla already earns roughly $2,000 per vehicle in software revenue through its full self-driving package and premium connectivity subscriptions. That's roughly half the profit margin of the physical car itself, delivered in software with near zero incremental costs once the platform exists. And then there's the segment play, trucks and SUVs. The single most important economic fact in the US auto industry is this: Ford earns more money from the F-Series pickup truck than most Fortune 500 companies earn from their entire business. In 2022, Ford's truck division generated an estimated $42 billion in revenue. The operating profit on a fully loaded F-150 or F-250 run 150 runs anywhere from $8,000 to $15,000 per unit. That's 3 to 6 times the margin on a comparable sedan. GM Chevy Silverado and GMC Sierra are similarly dominant. Those two trucks are responsible for a disproportionate share of GM's entire global profit pool. So here's the business in one line. You build commodity cars to maintain volume and dealer relationships, and you use trucks, luxury SUVs, financial services, and software to actually make money. And what's the stuff nobody warns you about? Labor is the obvious one, but the number surprises most people. A unionized U.S. auto worker after the 2023 UAW contract settlement earns a base wage of about $28 to $32 per hour at the top of the pay scale. But total compensation including benefits, healthcare, pension contributions, and overtime runs closer to $65 to $85 per hour in all-in cost per worker. A single U.S. assembly plant employs between 2,500 and 5,500 direct hourly workers. At full staffing, that's $300 to $650 million in annual labor costs for that one facility. Supplier dependency is the second hidden killer. Modern vehicles contain 20,000 to 30,000 individual parts sourced from hundreds of different companies. You are almost never making those parts yourself. You are buying them from Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers, who themselves depend on Tier 3 raw material providers. When a single semiconductor plant in Taiwan has a fire, or a port in Germany gets backed up, your assembly line stops, and a stopped assembly line burns money at a terrifying rate. The 2021 chip shortage cost the global auto industry an estimated $210 billion in lost revenue, with Ford and GM each losing billions in the US alone. GM estimated it lost about $2 billion in net income in 2021 directly from chip shortages. Ford lost a similar amount. Retooling costs are another budget killer that first-time operators don't expect. A typical vehicle model has a life cycle of about 6 to 8 years before it needs a major refresh or full replacement. Each retooling of an existing platform, changing the body, updating the interior, adding new technology, costs between $200 million and $1.5 billion and typically requires a partial or full plant shutdown for weeks or months. During that shutdown, you're still paying your fixed costs, facility, overhead, some portion of labor. Energy is another underestimated line item. A full-scale auto assembly plant uses as much electricity as a small city. The painting and body shop processes alone, which involve massive baking ovens, consume enormous amounts of natural gas and electricity. GM's Wentzville, Missouri assembly plant, for example, has invested heavily in on-site solar to offset energy costs that otherwise run into tens of millions of dollars per year. Warranty reserves are perhaps the most deceptive cost. When you sell a vehicle, you book a liability for future warranty claims at the moment of sale. If your quality control is off by even a fraction and defect rates climb, that warranty reserve blows up. Takata's airbag recall, which implicated nearly every major manufacturer, cost the industry over $24 billion globally. Ford's recall of 680,000 vehicles in 2023 over brake fluid contamination added hundreds of millions to its warranty exposure in a single quarter. So who's actually doing this well? Toyota is the clearest success story in the entire industry. It's worth spending time here because the Toyota model is the template every other manufacturer studies. Toyota's Georgetown, Kentucky plant, which opened in 1988, now produces about 550,000 vehicles per year, including the Camry, Avalon, and RAV4. Georgetown employs roughly 10,000 workers and has been profitable in nearly every year it's operated, including during years when American manufacturers were losing billions. Toyota's secret is something called the Toyota Production System, or TPS, often referred to elsewhere as lean manufacturing. The core idea is simple: eliminate every second and every dollar of waste from the production process. If a worker is waiting for a part, that wait time is waste. If a tool is in the wrong place, that's waste. Toyota measures defects in parts per million rather than parts per thousand. Its inventory system, called just-in-time, means parts arrive at the line within hours of being needed rather than sitting in a warehouse. This cuts inventory carrying costs, reduces defects, and keeps the line moving faster. The result: Toyota's plants run at capacity utilization rates of 90 to 95%, versus an industry average closer to 75 to 80%. That utilization gap is enormous. At 200,000 vehicles per year capacity, a 15-point utilization difference equals 30,000 extra vehicles and potentially $100 to $200 million in additional annual operating income. Toyota's operating profit margin on its vehicle business has averaged around 8 to 10% over the last 5 years, roughly double Ford's and triple GM's during the same period. Then there's Tesla, which took a completely different path and is worth examining closely because it's the only truly new mass-market manufacturer to reach scale in the last 50 years. Tesla's Vermont factory, running at about 550,000 to 600,000 vehicles per year, achieved an automotive gross margin of around 28% in 2022. That's extraordinary. Most manufacturers are operating at 10 to 15% gross margins on vehicles. Tesla, at its peak, was running at nearly double that. How? 3 things. First, Tesla sells direct to the customer, cutting out the dealer margin that typically sits between 3 and 8% of vehicle price. Second, its vehicles have far fewer parts than traditional internal combustion cars, reducing assembly complexity and cost. Third, software. Tesla charges $12,000 for its full self-driving package, which is almost entirely margin. That gross margin has since compressed to around 18% in 2023 and 2023, and 2024 as Tesla cut prices aggressively to maintain volume, but it illustrates what the ceiling looks like when you control the channel and the software. On the failure side, you don't need to look far. How do people lose their shirt on this? The most consistent failure pattern in this industry is building too much capacity and then being unable to fill it. A car plant has extremely high fixed costs. Whether you build 150,000 cars or 300,000 cars, your facility costs, your debt service on the capital you borrowed to build it, your base labor force, your energy bills, and your tooling depreciation stay roughly the same. That means when demand drops, your cost per vehicle skyrockets, because the fixed cost base doesn't move, but it's now being spread over fewer units. This is exactly what destroyed General Motors in 2009. GM had built its entire cost structure around selling 4.5 to 5 million vehicles per year in the US. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, US auto sales collapsed from about 16 million to 10 million units industry-wide. GM's US sales fell from around 3.7 million in 2007 to about 2.1 million in 2009. The fixed cost base didn't move fast enough. The result: GM burned through cash at a rate that made survival impossible without intervention. It filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in June 2009 after receiving $49.5 billion in US government bailout funds. Shareholders were wiped out. The US Treasury eventually recovered most of its investment, but GM bondholders took massive losses. The core lesson: your break-even volume is everything. If your plant needs to run at 80% capacity to cover costs, and a recession drops you to 60%, you are losing money on every car you build and every day you operate. Okay, so what can you actually walk away with? Let's run two real scenarios with real numbers, because this is the part that actually matters. Scenario 1. A regional or niche manufacturer. Think of something like a specialty truck upfitter, a performance vehicle brand like Hennessy or Celine, or a contract manufacturer that builds vehicles for another brand. Your own running a facility that produces 15,000 to 30,000 vehicles per year, often on a platform you've licensed or heavily modified rather than engineered from scratch. Capital cost to get here: somewhere between $150 million and $500 million, depending on how much of the platform engineering you can buy or license versus develop. Revenue at 25,000 units per year. Average vehicle price of $60,000, $1.5 billion in top-line revenue. Gross margin in the 12 to 18% range on specialty or performance product versus the thin margins on commodity cars. That gives you gross profit of $188 to $270 million before overhead. Subtract fixed overhead, SG&A, depreciation, and debt service on your $300 million build-out. Operating income somewhere in the range of $60 to $120 million per year. Payback period on your investment: 3 to 5 years in a good market. That's a viable business if you can maintain the niche and protect your margins. A real example: Magna International, the Canadian contract manufacturer, builds vehicles for BMW, Mercedes, and others at its Graz, Austria facility. It earns contract manufacturing margins of 4 to 7% on the vehicles it assembles, which on billions in revenue translates to a consistent and well-capitalized business. Scenario 2. A full-scale regional manufacturer competing in the mass market. You're operating a plant that produces 200,000 to 300,000 vehicles per year, competing in mainstream segments: sedans, crossovers, light trucks. Capital invested: $3 to $6 billion all in, including platform development, tooling, and working capital. Revenue at 250,000 units per year. Average transaction price of $38,000, $9.5 billion in annual revenue. Gross margin on mainstream vehicles: 10 to 14%, so gross profit of roughly $950 million to $1.3 billion. Fixed overhead at this scale, including R&D, amortization, corporate costs, and depreciation, runs another $400 to $600 million. Operating income: $350 million to $900 million per year, depending heavily on product mix, capacity utilization, and whether you've got a high-margin truck or SUV in the lineup. Financial services contribution: if you have a captive finance arm, add another $150 to $300 million. Payback on a $4.5 billion investment at $600 million in annual operating income, around 7 to 8 years, which is acceptable for infrastructure of this scale. The optimistic case looks like Toyota's Georgetown plant: 550,000 vehicles, strong product mix, lean operations, 8 to 10% operating margins, $700 million to $1 billion in annual operating income from a facility that cost roughly $3 billion to build and tool. That's a 30+% return on invested capital at peak performance. The realistic case looks more like a major North American plant hitting 75% utilization with moderate margins, 4 to 6% operating returns, a 12 to 15-year payback, and a business that survives on the quality of its truck lineup and the performance of its finance arm. The difference between those two outcomes is mostly this: product mix discipline, operational efficiency, and the willingness to not overbuild capacity when demand looks strong. Because that's the trap this industry sets over and over again. Demand looks strong, manufacturers add capacity, demand softens, and now you have a plant you can't fill and a cost structure you can't shrink fast enough. Toyota has avoided that trap better than anyone else in the industry for 40 years. So here's where you land after all of this. Owning a car factory is not a business where you make money by being good at building cars. You make money by being good at managing fixed costs, by having the right product in the right segment, and by monetizing the customer relationship long after the vehicle leaves your lot. The factory is the cost center. The truck lineup, the finance arm, and increasingly the software layer, those are the profit centers. Get those three things right, and a car factory is one of the most durable, cash-generating assets in the world. Get them wrong, and you've spent $3 billion building a machine that makes cars nobody's buying at margins that don't cover your debt service. The whole business in one line: build cars to keep the plant running, sell trucks to make money, and finance the customer to keep earning after they drive away. So yeah, you can own a car factory, Just make sure you know which part of the business is actually paying for it.